We'll go ahead and get started. I think as mentioned this morning, I'm Colonel Tim Bergeron. I'm the Deputy Commander for Administration at Eisenhower Army Medical Center, Fort Gordon, Georgia. A lot of the information that you're going to hear, or some of the information that you're going to hear, is duplicative of what you just heard, right? So I think most of us are going to experience the same thing as preceptors. But this will be a little bit more interactive, I think, or at least I hope it's a little bit more interactive. So how many of you have already precepted a resident, right? Just so that I kind of get a feel for who we're talking to. Okay, so some. And then some of the information that you're going to hear up front, I'm going to have a kind of a marketing plan. There's a few slides here that kind of market Eisenhower Army Medical Center, just to kind of give you an idea for who we are and what the resident is exposed to. And Steve Hankins, who had the job that I'm filling before, I'm asking him to please refrain from saying anything when I screw up, which I'm sure I will. So when I mentioned the building has 25 floors as opposed to 13, Steve, just don't say anything, all right? So help me out. One of the things I'll say up front is kind of from the military treatment facility perspective, we get residents, as mentioned, who have all kinds of different levels of experience, right? So there's the policy residency that occurs typically at headquarters levels, OTSG, health facility planning, et cetera. There's residency rotations that occur in Army medical treatment facilities, anywhere from a medical center through a smaller Army community hospital. And those tend to be, and Alan, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but those tend to be the more of the junior officers, right, or the junior residents. So they tend to take those with a little bit more experience, a little bit more senior officers, and those go to the policy residencies. And the more junior residents tend to go to military treatment facilities, and then some potentially to civilian rotations. But we tend to get, or at least the military treatment facilities tend to get the more junior residents as they come out of their didactic year. So we'll talk a little bit about that later. And as I go through this, if you've got questions, please go ahead and stop me, number one. Number two, again, as I mentioned, when we get to the end, I'm hoping that there's more of a conversation that occurs, right? So we'll go ahead and go to the next slide. So Eisenhower Army Medical Center, staffing, we've got about 2,672 staff. About 700 of those are active duty. The remainder are Army civilians, right? So it's a 91-bed facility with an average daily census of around 60. The eligible beneficiary population at Fort Gordon, which is in the city of Augusta, Georgia, which is Georgia's second largest city after Atlanta, is about 67,000, about half of which are enrolled. So 67,000 eligible beneficiaries in the civilian population, or in the population, and we enroll about half of those at our facility. The remainder are enrolled into civilian providers in the community just outside the gate. And we are blessed to have a very robust civilian healthcare network in the local area. So there are multiple medical facilities, both academic healthcare facilities as well as for-profit and not-for-profit facilities outside the gate of Fort Gordon. So it is a robust network. Some other things to note, we have an annual operating budget of around $260 million, and there are about 58 buildings that we're currently responsible for on Fort Gordon proper. The most noted of which, and you'll see it in a second, is a 13-story inpatient tower, if you will, but there are multiple buildings scattered across Fort Gordon that we're also responsible for that do multiple different things within the healthcare realm. We support Fort Gordon, Georgia is generally, well not generally, it is a training institution. So in the Army there are FORCECOM or Forces Command institutions or installations, generally where your active duty combat soldiers are headquartered. And then we have TRADOC or Training and Doctrine Command facilities where the Army sends its soldiers for training. And this is one of those. So Fort Gordon is a basic training, so initial entry training, as well as an advanced individual training installation, typically for those soldiers who are going through signals or cyber type training. So this is where the Army trains all of its computer technicians, communications technicians, et cetera, both on the enlisted soldier side as well as on the officer side. And so you'll see the number you'll see the number of units that we're responsible for in a training environment. There's the facility. Again, that's the 13-story inpatient tower, along with the logistics and dining facilities and support structures. You see 10 stories, so for those of you that are doing the math and actually counting, you're counting 10. There's actually 3 stories on the back side of this that are buried. So it's a sort of a walkout basement with 3 stories on the other end. So there actually is 13 floors. And you can see some of the statistics, about 2,000 clinic visits, about 16 admissions a day, 24 operations. So what makes us unique? So some of the things that Eisenhower is known for, we are the oldest and I think most robust inpatient treatment facility for substance abuse in the Army anyway. So we have just expanded from 28 inpatient beds to 36. So we have 36 beds that are available for soldiers across the spectrum, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and that's a 28-day program that we put those soldiers through. So we've recognized the need for that type of program within the DoD, and we are expanding to make that a reality. It's the region's only bio-level or BSL-3 lab, so we do have a BSL-3 lab at Fort Gordon. We end up taking samples from as far away as Puerto Rico, for example. That Zika issue that came up a few years ago, we were the ones that were doing a lot of that testing to determine whether or not individuals were exposed or had been exposed to Zika. We bill ourselves as the Army's only hyperbaric chamber, clinical hyperbaric chamber in the Southeast. We're able to put individuals into a hyperbaric chamber and to treat them. That's technically true. They do have a chamber at Fort Rucker, which is the Army's aeromedical, or actually it's the Army's helicopter training centers at Fort Rucker. They have a hyperbaric chamber there, although we claim that ours is, specifically for medical treatment. But there is another one down there, so it's not technically the only one in the Southeast. And one of the things that we're very proud of is Kendrick Army Blood Center provides about 22% of the Army's blood supply. So that also is co-located or located at Fort Gordon. Okay, so why do I say all that, right? I say all that to kind of give you an idea for what the resident that we get, currently we have a captain by the name of Wayne Hammond. So what is he potentially going to be exposed to? What are some of the things that he's got to kind of make him the healthcare executive that we're trying to train him to be? And so that's what Fort Gordon is, and that's what we currently have to offer. In addition to that, we also have the ability to send our resident up to Womack Army Medical Center, which is at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. They're able to do some additional things that potentially we're not doing, and so we've made plans to send Wayne up there. And we've also had the ability to send him regionally to some of the smaller medical treatment facilities in the Georgia region. So things like Fort Benning, Georgia, Fort Stewart, Georgia, up the road to South Carolina, to Fort Jackson, South Carolina. Those are all opportunities that our resident has in order to go out and see things that are not specific to Fort Gordon. So what I think is important is to ensure that the resident gets that balanced, hey, this is how we do business at Fort Gordon, but you also need to go down and see what a medical center like Womack up at Fort Bragg does, or out to the civilian community. We've got multiple opportunities to send our resident to civilian organizations for several weeks at a time. This is how we do it. Why don't we go out and look at how a civilian organization does it as well? So just very briefly, residency planning, how do we go through that? Again, it all starts with the bear, in my opinion, identifying what the competencies or what the resident's core competencies are, both based on that test that they take, the pre and post didactic year test, as well as what they're currently rating themselves. So kind of that exercise that we've done, looking at that bear and determining what you think the resident's needs are, and then sitting down with the resident and determining from his or her perspective, where do you think you need to focus? Because in the end, what it's all about is ensuring that the resident understands that it's not about graduation, although that's the 25-meter target is getting that degree that says, that says Baylor on it, right? But really, it's the 100, it's the 200-meter target, which is actually producing a healthcare executive that's able to execute what we want them to do, right? Because A, we want a healthcare executive that's going to be that strategic leader for the military, whether they're Army, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard, or VA. But you're also, that individual is going to transition out of the service at some point and is going to go off into the civilian community and be a civilian executive at some point. Most of these individuals, when they graduate, generally don't run off and decide to be a sailing instructor or sell potted plants or whatever. They generally tend to move off into the civilian community and do what they're doing in the military. And being able to provide that individual with those competencies, A, says a lot about Baylor, B, says a lot about the military, and C, is what we are looking for in our community. I think what we've seen is that healthcare is an expanding career field, if you will, in our economy, number one, but number two, as we get an aging population, more and more people are having to avail themselves of that sector of our economy, right? So that's what we are producing, and I think it's important for us to remember what it is that we are actually producing for the nation and not just for the DoD, right? So focusing on the bear. The second thing that I like to do is make sure that the resident focuses on those systems and skill sets necessary to ensure that they're able to go out and execute an effective rotation, right? And what do I mean by that? I generally like to front load all of the administrative departments first, right? So making sure that they get to your resource management shop, making sure that they get to human resources, making sure that they get to information management, that they either A, identify the need that they don't understand how to get into the clinical systems, right? So all of the data systems in the facility, where do you mine the data necessary to produce an effective analysis, right? So if they don't have that competency up front, making sure that they have it. B, making sure that they identify individuals within the organization that they can go to that are going to help them to pull the data, right? To go in and show them, what does this actually mean? What does this set of data actually mean, right? If they don't have those A, skill sets, B, competencies, or C, relationships up front, if you load that clinical residency first, or that clinical rotation first, they identify an issue within the facility that they want to get into a project with, then they have to go back around at the same time or concurrently and try to figure out, okay, what data system do I need? How do I get access to it? Who's got the keys to it? And who can tell me what the data actually means, right? So making sure that they have the administrative skill set up front and the relationships first, I think, is important. Third, identifying, like I said, those informal preceptors, right? Because we are not going to have the time to sit down with our resident every single day and kind of walk them through what's going on. I think we'd all like to, given the responsibility that we have to produce a quality healthcare executive, but we just don't. That's just not reality. So identifying individuals that resident can go to learn the skills or ask the questions necessary to be able to continue to move forward even without us being there every single day, right? And then last is that letter of introduction, which I think is very useful. So once you start getting into or outside of the administrative areas, the clinical department chiefs and clinic chiefs that the resident is going to rotate through, at least all of my administrative staff understand what a Baylor resident is and what they're doing. Because they've either been through the program or I'm talking about it constantly in my staff meetings. But the clinicians tend to rotate out. You only see the resident like once a year for a certain amount of weeks, and then they don't generally interact with that resident because the resident moves on to another rotation in the facility. But introducing the resident, talking about what Baylor is, what are we looking for them to provide that resident, what kind of experience should that resident be getting, I think is very important. And like I mentioned, that's something that the resident writes up and that I look at, make sure that it says what we want it to say, and then the resident makes sure that that department chief gets it 2 weeks before he or she shows up, number one, and then number two, I follow up at the executive level when we have executive staff meetings to say, hey, Bob, or hey, Susie, residents coming next week, or A, did you get the letter, B, you understand what we're looking for, and I get the north-south, or we sit down and readjust if there's a negative response there. I think that's very, very key. So, moving on. Mentorship, we kind of talked through this. What's your role as a preceptor? It really is being a mentor, and it's producing a product for the DHA or for the MHS. making sure that what you get is a quality product at the end. So, ensure that the resident understands the environment that he or she is working in. And we talked about, we chatted a little bit about that in a slide previous. Challenging the resident to see the stakeholders' perspective. So a lot of times a resident will coming right out of the Baylor program, and it's black or right. It's either black or white, right? This is the right answer. This is messed up. This is the way to fix it. Go out and execute. And a lot of times, that's what our clinical colleagues are. That's one of the things that they complain about. The classic administrator who doesn't understand the clinical perspective, right? So having that conversation with the resident to say, well, why? It's the why, right? Why is it that this is what's going on at that, down in that clinic? Is it just that they don't care? Is it just that they're not bright? The answer probably is no. There's probably something else going on that we're not considering. So understanding, being able to crawl in the head of that clinical colleague to find out why is it that this is occurring at the clinical level, and then what can we do as administrators to try to ensure that gets better, right? And then, like I mentioned, how does each part of the facility work together? What are the friction points? It's identifying that problems generally aren't just a lack of ability or willingness to care, right? So trying to understand there's a political component in a lot of ways, or in many cases, to why things are the way they are, and helping the resident to understand that. So a lot of times it's not struggling through the, what's the statistics actually say, or how do you do the analysis. There is some of that, but there also is the rest of the story that the resident generally doesn't understand that you're having to help them out with. Okay, so project development, how do we develop projects? From my perspective, what I generally tend to do is we get the resident to work themselves through the administrative areas, like I mentioned, get familiar with all the data systems, demonstrate competence that they know how to work that and identify those relationships. And then B, we send them out to do rotations. And as the resident works their way through the rotation, what I generally tend to get are the senior individuals in the facility coming to me with, hey, I understand we have a resident, that's fantastic, and here's a list of things that I want them to fix in my area, right? Or the resident will go out and say, like, man, this really isn't working well. I don't understand why, this is happening. I don't understand why it's, 8 weeks to get an MRI. Or I don't understand why, this is the way the organization is structured. And so they'll come in with, I think this might be a good project, or I think there may be an opportunity, and then we can talk our way through, is that enough? Is there enough meat there for you to get in and develop a quality product that's going to give you the experience necessary to walk away with, A, with a project for Baylor that meets the requirement, but B, not only helps the organization, but gives you a general overall perspective of something that you can add to your skill set. Number two, using the resident as a force multiplier. We talk a little bit about, they spend a year here and they come out with a very specific skill set, and they understand a lot of the skills that a lot of the individuals in our facilities tend to lose over time. So bringing in the latest and greatest and using the resident, not just to teach the resident, but also using the resident to teach our staff, who generally tend to get a little stale, right? So it's like using physicians as they come out of their training programs, right? Putting them with an older physician, potentially, or a more seasoned physician, and basically having that resident not only learn, but also be able to tell the staff that, hey, that we don't really use that piece of equipment anymore. There's this really awesome laser now. You don't have to do it by hand, right? So using the resident to come in and maybe teach our staff, like, hey, there's a better way of doing this analysis. Or Colonel Jones mentioned that, here's the latest and greatest on whatever the topic happens to be. So that's what I mean by force multiplier. So there's a two-way relationship. It's not just teaching the resident, but it's also learning from the resident, what the latest and greatest is as far as books are concerned. Okay. These are just some of the project, some of the examples, things like a business case analysis, productivity, process improvement, et cetera. These are I'm not telling you guys anything that you don't already know as far as what are types of projects that a Baylor resident can do. We heard about it a few slides ago. So I would caution you when you start talking about things like BCAs, what you end up getting in a lot of ways are, you can go down a whole bunch of rabbit holes, right? And so the resident's got 3 pages to write up, here's what it is that we're looking to do, or here's what this BCA is going to say. But a BCA it's a business plan, right? You're writing up, this is what my business is going to look like, almost like if you were going to go to a bank and get a loan. And those tend not to be things that you can condense into 3 pages in a real easy way. And so what I found with residents is when they go down the BCA road, trying to figure out how to condense all that into 3 pages, they go into these cheetah flips about, well, I can't say everything I want to say. I can't present all the data I want to present. I'm going to get hemmed up at Baylor. Colonel Jones is going to string me up by my heels because I can't, and so you generally tend to spend an awful lot of time trying to train your resident or trying to teach your resident to how to condense it down into 3 pages. I'm not saying don't do BCAs. I'm just saying from my perspective, sometimes from a preceptor's perspective, it's more work than it's worth. Okay, so, or maybe it's just my resident. So, thank you, Alan. So final thoughts. I guess some of the things I would say up front are be involved with the resident, right? Understand that you're actually producing a product for the DHA and also for our country as a whole, number one. Number two, what I generally tend to do is I meet with the resident on a weekly basis. So I'll set up about 90 minutes once a week where we'll sit down, we'll go through the things that resident has gone through or that my resident has gone through, give him or her an opportunity to just sort of talk through, here are the challenges that I've got, here's what I think, this is what my project is like. And that gives them a predictable time every single week where they know they can sit down and they can address concerns or issues, or whether it's professional or personal. Although, again, that said, Wayne Hammond, who was my resident, generally tended to come in a lot more frequently than that. So, making sure that you're open to the resident coming in and being able to discuss what needs to be discussed. But I found that kind of very regular interaction produced a situation where we didn't end up generally getting into situations where it was, oh my God, I haven't met with you in 4 weeks. I've gotten this email from Baylor that I'm not going to pass, or that my project is garbage and I got to start over again. So by meeting with them regularly, we tended to short circuit an awful lot of problems where you're going to identify it before they send it to Baylor, and then they come back with, what is your resident doing and why did we get this? So I generally tend to think that being involved early tends to make things easier on the resident, you, and on the Baylor staff as well. A couple other things, and then I'll be done, I promise. During the year that I had the resident, one of the questions that I constantly asked myself was, or had to be aware of, is what is the resident going to do when they graduate, right? So once they're finished with the Baylor program, what is that resident what is it that we're producing, right? We talked about producing leaders, but making sure that you understand where the resident is going, whether they're going to be a nurse methods analyst at an MTF, whether they're going to be at the chief of clinical operations division, whether they're going to be, whatever that next role is, and then while you're giving the resident that experience in your medical treatment facility, you're also hopefully tailoring that residency a little bit so that you're setting them up for what the next job is going to be. Because you don't want to kick them out at the end of the year. They've got a nice shiny Baylor degree, they go off to their next job, and then they're a massive failure because they didn't really understand what that next role was going to be within the system. So tailoring it a little bit. And then finally, two more things. Making sure that resident has credibility with the C-suite, right? So it's very tempting to sort of push the resident off into an academic environment. They do their rotations, they're developing projects, they're working with you, they're talking to Baylor, but nobody in the C-suite sees them, right? Which is fine. The executive leadership is very happy not to see your resident. But what you end up getting is, unless that resident is having regular interactions with very senior individuals within the organization, when they graduate, they're going to be a mid-level leader within the organization, and they're going to be expected to brief the hospital CEO or the hospital commander or the deputy commander regularly. And if they don't have that sort of skill set necessary for them to do that effectively, then what you've done is you've left out a significant component of their skill set. So credibility with the C-suite. How do you gain that? You make sure that they're going to the executive committee meetings, that they're attending the executive committee, the medical staff, that they're actually briefing the senior leaders within the organization, putting them in front of senior lieutenant colonels or 06 or colonels, 06s, individuals in very senior leadership positions. And that generates confidence, and it generates the confidence that they have the ability to A, find an issue, analyze the data, produce recommendations, brief those recommendations, and it goes back to what was mentioned earlier. What you don't want is an executive leader or a senior leader, with, well, I think this probably might be the answer to the question that we're looking for, but I'm not really going to give you, right? You want somebody that's going to come in and say, I've done the homework, I understand the problem, and here's what I'm saying you need to do in order to fix it. So the last thing I'll say is most of these individuals are going to work in, whether it's a civilian organization or a military health organization. More of these organizations are becoming more and more civilianized, right? I know mine is very heavily civilianized. A lot of these individuals are coming into the Baylor program with very little experience working with or supervising civilian employees. And so it goes back to what we talked about. They have the knowledge, they have the skills, but it's that attitude, right? A lot of that attitude that we're looking for is how do you take a military officer and train them or give them the attitude necessary to work collegially with civilian staff members in the organization. That's something that in many cases is lacking, right? Because we're used to, well, this is the answer, I'm used to running, or I'm used to being in charge of a bunch of soldiers, go out and do whatever it is I tell you to do. And that attitude doesn't necessarily work or doesn't necessarily translate into a collegial or a productive relationship in a healthcare facility, right? And so it's teaching them how to affect individuals, how to get those individuals to participate on a team and produce a result or a product that is beneficial to the organization. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, that's kind of all I'm sorry? No, right. So that's kind of all I had. I might have a couple of minutes. Does anyone have any questions or thoughts, ma'am, in the back?
Yes. Can you talk a little bit about, I'm trying to find it here on the competencies, how you got your resident and to what depth of involvement in the area, probably of individual and organizational behavior with respect to any sort of civilian human resource management issues, which I'm sure have to exist.
Right, yes. So for those of you that didn't hear, how did I get the resident to participate in challenges associated with civilian human resource management? What I ended up doing was just happenstance. I am the individual or the point person that deals with all of our EEO, EO, legal issues, union issues, et cetera. So anytime there was any sort of interaction whatsoever with any of our civilians as it relates to, they file a union grievance or there's an EEO complaint, I generally had my resident in the room. We would have do you mind if my student sits here? And we would go through the issue, and they would sit off to the side, and we'd kind of work our way through it, the union president and myself, or the employee and his or her representative. And then at the end, once we had either resolved it or agreed to disagree or agreed that it was going to go to the next step, I would hold the resident, and he would have a conversation about how would you have done that, right? Or what would you have done if you were sitting in my shoes? And we'd kind of work our way through a bit of an AAR. And in many cases at the beginning it was, well, you should just fire them, right? And we talk our way through like why that doesn't work, right? So at the end, there's I think a more realistic expectation on their part about how those types of issues get resolved in our system. Anyone else? Sir?
Just real quick, sir. Did you have any issues with competing against GME programs and them taking up time with the clinical leaders and FaceTime and that from that perspective.
So in other words, just if you can, so like having the GME director try to pull the resident away and.
Well, no, just so when you're sending them off to orthopedics and they have their own GME folks are working about competing with time. So was your resident sitting more with the administrators of those areas, or were they getting FaceTime with the clinical leaders too?
No, they actually got, I had no issues making sure that they had FaceTime with the clinical leaders. I think a lot of the GME program, specifically with the clinical GME students, they were off, in the OR cutting or, but the Baylor resident or my resident generally tended not to be competing for the same individual for their time, if you will. So it was, talking to the department chief or shadowing, a staff physician, making sure that they were getting into the OR. And really what I build it as is not necessarily a, hey, there's this administrative spy that's coming out to see all of the things that you're not doing right, but more of a, you, I'm sure, senior clinician in the department have issues with administrators. I'm going to give you a student administrator for 2 weeks who's going to follow you around, and you get to complain about all of the things that administrators don't understand and what you'd like to fix, right? So you're effectively building an administrator the way you would want them built. And then when they come back to me and we have a conversation, I tell them why that's all wrong, and, so.
So
Steve.
Did y'all maintain the Baylor resident being in the same competitions for residency awards and everything this past year?
No, I generally tended to break I exempted, if you will, the Baylor resident from a lot of the same clinical type. They were in the GME program. Their picture was kind of up on the big poster with all the rest of the residents and interns. But that was as far as I allowed the resident to integrate himself into the GME program, if that makes sense. So did not compete with any of the rest of the residents for any of the awards or anything like that. So, anyone else? Okay, that's all I have. Thank you all very much. I appreciate it.